Thank you very much. Although I think there are maybe one or two elements of that biography that we need to update. I'm no longer the longest-serving First Minister, but I'm still the youngest First Minister, so I'll take that as an alternative description. I've also been coming here to ICD for 4 years and trying to get this Union Jack replaced with a Scottish saltire. And at some point I'm going to bring one with me and make sure it hangs behind me here when I speak just before Christmas every year. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for staying to hear what I have to say this evening. I really enjoyed the presentation from the former Prime Minister of Cyprus, who was talking in some detail about peacebuilding and has allowed me to take about 5 minutes out of what I was going to say, because I would completely endorse the 4 principles in particular that she outlined and everything else that she had to say about that very, very important topic. I want to talk briefly tonight about the debate on the global development agenda post-2015. And I want to relate what I have to say about that to 3 key issues, one being human rights, the second being conflict and conflict-affected states, and the third being culture and development, to just finish the evening's discussions before our panel on a cultural note, which I think is particularly important. Can I just recap what's happened since the year 2000? The global community agreed in 2000 that they would set development goals for the new millennium. Those goals were agreed and established. In many ways, they avoided some of the more difficult issues that could have been addressed at that time, but they did focus, perhaps rightly for the time, on the key social developments that were required. There were goals on poverty and hunger, on child mortality, on women's empowerment, on sustainable development, on education, health, and on disease eradication. There was also a commitment to a new global partnership, which has at least been partly realised, but I think is perhaps about to change even more fundamentally. And those goals have transformed the lives of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people across the developing world. The action that's been taken, the focus that is given, has made a real difference. But there were key elements missing from them. There was no reference in those Millennium Development Goals to security, to jobs, to justice, or to democracy or democratic institutions. And that perhaps reflected where the global community was at that time, in that there was no global agreement on the importance of those issues. But we're now in a new debate for the period after 2015, 2015 being the deadline for reaching the original Millennium Development Goals. And many of those goals will be reached in many of the countries that are affected. But we're now in a new debate about what comes next, and that's what I want to address this evening. That debate, I suppose, was kicked off in 2012, the appointment of a high-level panel of eminent persons led by Liberia, the UK, and Indonesia, which produced an excellent and absolutely outstanding report in May of this year, which set out the principles and the actions that might be taken post-2015 for a new global partnership, pulling together not just traditional development in the developing world, but the rights that might exist on a universal basis, and also the key issue of sustainable development for the longer term, for the first time integrating that into the wider development targets of the global community. And then crucially in September this year, that report provided the focus for a debate at the UN General Assembly and the agreement of an outcome statement that's pointed the way ahead for the 2 years to come. And over those 2 years, there are now going to be debates, intergovernmental negotiations, an attempt to reach an agreement for the next period. And then eventually in September 2015, the UN General Assembly will be asked to agree the next set of goals post-2015 that will provide a focus for, not just for international aid, but for international action in the decade and a half that will follow. And that new global framework will, I believe, given the events of this year, be focused on a set of universal rights. No longer a dependent relationship where the United Nations member states agree a set of goals that are really about how much of a contribution the North makes to the South, improving its position, but about a set of universal goals that matter absolutely everywhere. And I know, for example, Liberia was very strong on this in the discussions on the high-level panel, that a woman who's suffering violence in London is just as important as a woman who's suffering violence in Lagos. Or someone who can't go to school on a small island somewhere is just as important as somebody who is unable to attend the local school because of poverty in a huge urban slum. And setting out those universal rights will be a basis for global action, but set targets for countries all over the world to reach, not just those who have been behind or who have fallen behind. So I want to move on to the three areas that I see as priorities, and certainly in relation to this conference, but I think should underpin any new agenda. The first, of course, is human rights itself. It is, frankly, for me, disgraceful that we live in a world today, 65 years on from the original signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with still today hundreds of millions of people on the globe who don't have the chance to exercise even the most basic rights from that declaration, whether it's in relation to land ownership, access to justice, freedom from violence, or freedom of expression. Those basic rights diminish the prospects for development, both individual human development and collective society development. And therefore, I think that the right to development, the right for women to play a full part in society, and all these other human rights must form the core of the new post-2015 development framework. And that has been recognised this year by both the UN task groups working on this, but perhaps more significantly for momentum, the high-level panel itself. And they made very clear in their report in May that we have to ensure that no person, regardless of ethnicity, gender, geography, disability, race, or other status, is denied basic economic opportunities and human rights. They set that out as a key target for this period from 2015 to 2030, and in my view, they were absolutely right to do so. But within that generalisation about the importance of human rights, there is one group of countries, it's not one group of people, a whole number of groups of people, for whom the Millennium Development Goals have meant much less, and for whom progress has been scandalously slow. And that is those countries that have been affected by conflict, and those people who live in those countries affected by conflict. Until fairly recently, it looked as if every country, every fragile state in the world listed in the list of fragile states was going to miss every single Millennium Development Goal. There are, in fact, a few now who might make 2 or 3 of the goals, but generally across the board, the Millennium Development Goals are not going to be reached by countries that have been affected by conflict, countries where the state itself is fragile. 1/3 of the world's poor live in those countries, and by 2015, half of those who are living on less than $1.25 a day, the recognised poverty rate, will be living in those fragile states. And for me, that means that those countries, but more particularly the conditions in those countries that have produced that result, have to be an absolute priority in any new global development framework. It is possible to see over the next 15 years countries that are already making some progress, make faster progress through economic growth and social development and empowerment. But those countries that are affected by conflict are far more likely to fall further behind, and the people who live in them are far more likely not to send their children to school, not to have access to employment, to die young, to be subject to violence, and to have no access to justice if they are. And the global community has to take an interest in those countries in particular, the billion or so people who live within them. And thankfully and progressively, those countries themselves are now starting to take a stand. The Dili Consensus that was agreed in Timor-Leste last February by a group of fragile states known as the G7+, but also at a meeting that included many of the Pacific Islands and the Portuguese-speaking countries of the world, they agreed this particular statement, which makes very clear that they recognise that the Millennium Development Goals were insufficient for their needs, and that the new global framework has to include inclusive economic growth, state effectiveness, peace and justice, and climate change and environmental management, all things that were missing from the original Millennium Development Goals. And with that push from those states most directly affected, and this group of states included Afghanistan, Liberia, Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste itself, Haiti, a whole series of countries across Africa, Burundi, Somalia, and a number of others, all taking a stand to say that they wanted something more from this new global framework. A lot of talk recently about the many, many remarkable quotes attributed to Nelson Mandela. But for me tonight, one of his most significant was that peace is the greatest weapon for development. And I think we have to realise that the establishment of stable peace is an absolute prerequisite for sustainable development and for meeting these global development aspirations. And we now have increasing evidence about what works, and I'm not going to repeat everything that the former Prime Minister said in her speech just a short time ago. But we now have many examples and lots of evidence about what actually works to improve the situation in fragile states, and also how important it is that we tackle those issues because of the impact on the people who live there in terms of sustainable development. Now, the reason I raise this at this conference is if we're talking about diplomacy and we're talking about cultural diplomacy, I think there are two fundamental issues for those who are here to take part in these discussions through the ICD and perhaps even for the ICD itself. The first is that there is a reason behind why the Millennium Development Goals did not include these issues 13 years ago. And that is that at that time, perhaps in a post-Cold War environment, still with considerable suspicion around the world about the interests, not just of the United States, as Bertie has just referenced, but of others too. The idea of international focus on fragile and conflict states was seen as a threat to those states, not something that would enhance their opportunities, but something that was more likely to diminish them because of the behaviour of the superpowers in the past. And a whole series of powerful, strong, non-aligned countries, or traditionally non-aligned countries, were against the UN coming out to say anything at all about these important issues of state institutions, state efficiency and effectiveness, about justice, about jobs, and about the importance of democracy and institutions. But that atmosphere is changing, and I think changing increasingly rapidly. And therefore we did see this year at the UN General Assembly this key statement agreed perhaps for the first time in recent times. The importance of promoting human rights, good governance, the rule of law, transparency and accountability at all levels. In the statement that sets up the debate now on the specific goals that will come out of in this framework in 2015. And that the agreement of that set of important principles now gives us an opportunity, I think, over the next 2 years to try and redress this balance. And the key support of countries, for example, Turkey, which has moved from being a country that in the past lined up with others to oppose these agreements at an international level, now a key advocate for this kind of approach, and many others too, I think gives us real hope. And it seems to me that in diplomacy over these next 2 years, making this case that it would simply be wrong if by 2030 the majority of countries in the world, the majority of people in the world, the majority of developing countries and people from developing countries in the world have managed to find their way out of extreme poverty. But those who have been living in the worst conditions are still in them because of a lack of international action and attention. I think that would be completely unforgivable. And the second point I want to make is about culture. That was a map, by the way, but a very well painted one that I think highlights the diversity of the world. And I think culture has a role to play in all of this. And I might say something about UNESCO here that might appeal to the ambassador. given what she has been saying over these last 2 days. But it seems to me that understanding other cultures, celebrating diversity, both between countries, cross countries, but within countries as well, is absolutely essential if we're going to make progress in the hardest places for development. You cannot succeed in sustainable development by imposing solutions and ideas from elsewhere. That homegrown, local solutions will always be best, and those that reflect cultural identity and cultural history and that celebrate different cultures are more likely to succeed in the longer term. And it certainly has to be the case that development projects and policies that have not fully taken into account the cultural dimension have failed in the past and will continue to fail in the future. So I believe very strongly that culture contributes to successful development programs. It contributes to both economic development, but also environmental sustainability, and it contributes to peace and security as well. And a greater cultural understanding, a greater cultural affinity can make a real difference. And I wanted to finish on this point, given that we're here to talk about cultural diplomacy. I think culture and development, attention to both go hand in hand and can produce really sustainable, long-term results that can make a huge difference across our globe. And that has been recognised, of course, by UNESCO and their call to make sure that culture is at the heart of sustainable development policies in the future, and their call just this year for culture to play a role in this important debate over the next 2 years and in the framework that's agreed in 2015. So that is my plea, that we not only agree a new global framework, but we ensure that within that new global framework, issues of conflict and security, of violence, of access to justice, and of human rights play a role, but also that we recognize, we persuade the world that culture and cultural diversity is a key ingredient in all of that. And if we achieve that in 2 years' time, there'll be many more people having a Merry Christmas. Thank you very much.